In one of the more recent updates to DaVinci Resolve, they added a built-in halation effect. This is really great because prior to that, in order to accomplish something that resembled halation, it took this, I don't know, convoluted, cumbersome node workflow that I don't even know how people even came up with it. I want to compare the halation that comes with Resolve Studio now to the halation tool that you can get from Dehancer. And within the halation effect in Resolve, there's something that I would call bloom, although it's not labeled that in the effect. So I want to also compare the bloom from Dehancer, the halation from Dehancer, with what you get in Resolve Studio. Finally, within the halation effect in Resolve, there is a simplified film grain. So you can use that if you don't want to go to the more robust and feature-filled film grain plugin that's already available within Resolve. Anyway, I just want to compare all those kinds of things. There's a lot to compare. I don't know, but halation, bloom, film grain, Resolve Studio versus Dehancer. That's what we're going to do. This video is not sponsored, but I do have an affiliate link with Dehancer. If you are interested in it, you can save 10% on the full version or any of the individual effects if you use my promo code. Before we get into the comparison, just real quick, I want to show you exactly what halation is. And if you know already, skip over this part. I'm going to keep it really brief. And I only mention this because I've seen a lot of people on YouTube conflate halation with bloom. What halation is kind of this red bloom, or maybe even this kind of red outline, and it appears in really high contrast areas. Halation is just, it's a photochemical defect, I suppose. And it was something that film manufacturers were trying to minimize and trying to get rid of as much as possible because it wasn't seen as like a necessarily desirable artifact of shooting with film. Nowadays that people are trying to emulate the look of film on digital, this is something to make your stuff look more convincing. So I just have a few clips here. I just duplicated them so we can do one with the Resolve effect and one with the Dehancer effect. So this will be Resolve halation and Resolve grain. And I've already added a Kodak 2383 film look or film LUT to all these clips here, but that's all I've done to these clips. I'm not sure we might not get through all these clips, but I chose ones that I thought would definitely have some opportunities for legitimate halation. So let's start there. Just come up to your effects panel and search for halation and then pull this over onto a node. And right away you can see lots of stuff happening here. I'll just toggle that off. So there it is with no halation. Sorry, you're hearing a helicopter fly by. And toggling it on, the whole image warms up. There's some red coming into the image as a whole. And there's also, if you zoom in, you can see the red halo in these high contrast areas. So that's just the effect kind of defaulting. It's a little bit too much. In my opinion, it's a little crazy. It's putting it in places that aren't as high contrast. So we'll see how you can dial that back or change that. Coming over to the effects properties, the very top thing, you have a processing color space. So if it's in use timeline, whatever you have your timeline set to, Rec 709 or HDR or whatever, that's what it's going to be. But then you can also change this to different film gamma, color space, all that kind of stuff. Or you can use DaVinci wide gamut, up to you depending on how you are going to output your final project. Next you have isolation, and these controls allow you to decide where the halation is going to happen, which regions of the image it will appear. And it also has a toggle to view the isolated regions, which is helpful, but not as helpful as I would like. We'll get to the specifics of these. Let me just go through the whole thing so you're aware. Dye layer reflections basically fine tunes the effect itself. So once you've put the effect where you want it to, this will determine how wide the halation is or how narrow, how saturated, etc., etc., etc. Secondary glow is what is bloom, but it's bloom that's limited to the same areas that the halation is occurring in. So it's not bloom that would occur throughout the entire image, but only where you would see halation, which is kind of weird to me. Next, you've got the basic grain. So this is a very simplified grain overlay, and we'll use this and also compare it to the more extensive grain effect that you can get in Resolve. Last, you just have global adjustments. Aspect ratio, it's hard to quantify exactly what's happening. You can just see it here as you slide this. It's meant to mimic You know, if you were to shoot on anamorphic lenses versus spherical, it doesn't give you like this way is anamorphic and this way is spherical. So it's just slide that until you are happy with the results. You've got a global blend, so this is basically just the overall strength. In the global adjustments as well, you also have another way to isolate the effect so you can really see it. And this one is, to me, much more useful than this view isolated regions one, but I don't know, maybe I'm just thinking about it the wrong way. Okay, so now let's get into the particulars. Coming back up to the top for isolation, the way I think about it, the threshold is basically deciding how bright something has to be or how contrasty the edge of something has to be in order for the halation to appear. When you slide this over, you're basically just getting this global halation everywhere. And then if you slide it to the right, it's limiting things more and more and more to only the highest contrast areas. This area isn't as super high contrast as this area. So that's a good way to illustrate. You're seeing it here, and then as you slide this over to the right, now it's going away from this area and it's remaining in higher contrast areas. Toggle that on, and you should be able to see it as you move that threshold. Finally, the only things that are left are the really, really bright, contrasty areas. And then as you slide normalization over, you're getting halation everywhere. It's allowing less and less bright things to become halated. It's not a word, but we're using it. Film saturation level has to do with really HDR workflows. If you're mastering for HDR and you want to make sure that the halation remains bright enough to be seen on like a really, instead of like 100 nit level for SDR, you're working with like 1,000 nits or something. This will really increase the brightness of the halation effect. So you can see that here in the isolated, how much brighter that's getting versus that. But it's really only for HDR. I mean, if you really want your halation to be bright, you can use this, but that's what it's meant to do. So now I have it isolated to the regions that I think that you would most likely see it. You can come down to the dye layer reflections and we'll see that strength. Gamma says how the glow spreads out. So in its default position, you can see there. And then as you slide it to the right, it starts spreading more and it also becomes more saturated. And then you can also see that there's sort of an orange edge and then it gets redder towards the center, I guess. Saturation, obviously. And then spread. I like it in its default state the best, I think. It's also battling with some chromatic aberration from the lens as well. You can see that purple fringing there. That's chromatic aberration that was already in the shot. If I turn the halation off, you can see that there. Okay, secondary glow, and I'll just crank that strength, and you can see that it's blooming the highlights. The reason I don't like this is not only is it blooming the highlights, it's also blooming just the halation areas. And it's getting these weird, I don't know what's going on here. You know, what is that? Why is it doing that? So if you dial down this gamma so it doesn't get crazy, you only see this on the halation, some of the halation areas. You don't see it in the windows, which I would expect it to be in. If you crank the gamma so you start seeing it in highlight areas, then you start losing, like, what is going on here? This is weird outliney posterizing thing happening. That's the secondary glow. And yeah, I don't like it too much. Next is the basic grain. So to toggle that on, hit append grain internally, and then you just have sliders for strength, size, softness, and saturation. Pretty simple. You can crank that strength up to where it looks crazy, soften it, and make it saturated. So that looks pretty cool. Okay, maybe not. Let's reset all those and zoom in a little bit. It doesn't look bad, but I would definitely prefer using the full film grain effect because you really have a lot more control over the size, the strength, and also where the grain happens. In this one, it's basically just going to be overlaid on top of the entire image. Reduce highlights, I guess, means that when you apply the halation, it sort of is could potentially be boosting the overall highlight level or the exposure in a way. I don't see that a whole lot in the waveforms here. If you reduce highlight, you lose even more of where the halation is occurring, so it's really limiting the overall effect, but it doesn't seem to be changing too much the exposure of it. So I would just say that this is just another way to fine tune where and how much you're seeing halation. Obviously, going that way, it looks pretty wacky, but coming back this way, it's starting to reduce even more the edges that get the halation. And detail loss is a weird one. It basically just adds a blur effect. It just looks like a Gaussian blur or something. I don't know why you'd want to use that. Okay, so that's it. That's halation. That's the built-in halation effect in Resolve Studio. Let me go to one more clip and then just throw it on there real fast. I'm not going to go through the whole thing again, but in this clip right here, I would imagine would be a good spot, would be a good candidate for seeing it. So let's try and see what happens here. Put that on. It added it right to that edge as I would expect, but it also adds it to some other lower contrast areas that I wouldn't necessarily expect it to be. Let's see if we can dial it in some more. So that works better. So it's still here, but it took it out of this part here, which is what I would like. And we can increase that a little bit so it's more evident. Dial that down so it's not quite so posterized. That looks pretty good, I think. I want to just show you the film grain. I don't want to go into detail because this isn't necessarily about the film grain in itself, but just the difference. If you go to the full film grain effect, which is called film grain, there's just a lot more fine tuning of it. So you can start with a preset. You can go from 8 millimeters to 16 to 35 millimeters. You know, you can start with that, and or you can just use these sliders to determine how big the grain size is, all that kind of stuff. And then once you start messing with these sliders, you can see that the preset changes to custom. But the other really neat thing about this one is you can determine where and how much grain shows up in different luminance values or areas in the shot, which is what I usually like to do and take it out of the midtones a little bit. It really depends on what you're going for, but just so it's not obscuring a lot of detail in people's faces. And I like to try to put it in the highlights more. And then depending on the scene, maybe crank it in the shadows a little bit more, just so it's more apparent, especially for YouTube where a lot of the compression is gonna obscure some of the grain. But there's really not a penalty for using the big film grain effect as opposed to using the one from the halation effect. So now let's go back to that. Well, actually, let's stay with this one here since we're on it. And let's check out the Dehancer halation. Search for Dehancer. And the annoying thing about Dehancer is that it enables a bunch of stuff off the bat. So I'm not going to go through an entire tutorial or entire walkthrough of Dehancer Pro. I already have multiple videos on it. I also have a video walking through how Halation and Bloom work. So if you are interested in seeing that, I'll put a link up and I'll put a link in the description. But I'm going to turn off the film emulation and I'm going to turn off the film grain. And that should get us back to where we started. And then come down to halation, and then I'm going to enable it. So just like with the Resolve halation, when you turn it on, you can see that it does kind of this, it warms up the entire image, in addition to adding the halation to high contrast edges. And that's something that would happen, certain film stocks, certain conditions. The red layer would, I guess, become sort of like globally polluted and would give you kind of this overall red tint. And you can control that here. So that's going to be the global diffusion slider in Dehancer. So if you crank that up, it becomes redder. But if you slide it all the way to the left, you basically get rid of it. By default, the halation and Dehancer is much more sensitive, I think. You barely see it. This, all the default settings, you're seeing it right here, and you're seeing just a little bit right here. Very, very small amount. Start by local diffusion. That has to do with the contrasty edge, how much you're going to see it. Cranking that up a little bit, it'll start to come in to those edges a lot more than it was. Amplify is basically just a strength slider. The nice thing about Dehancer as well is you have a hue slider. So by default, it's in the middle. So you get this color, and then coming over to the left, it becomes much more purely red, and then over to the right, it starts becoming orangey and yellow. You also have an overall impact slider, similar to what you had in Resolve. A good place to start would just be the local diffusion. You could decide how much you want to see the overall effect. And then I would come up to the source limiter. And this basically says that the more over to the right you slide this, it'll start limiting where the halation occurs to brighter and brighter and brighter areas. So finally over here, it has to be super bright and contrasty in order to actually see it. And the more over to the left it is, you can have less contrasty areas start picking up the halation. Background gain, you see it in the darker border, right? So that's what background gain does, just basically how bright it becomes on that dark edge. So that's that one, and compare it to this one. I mean, the overall effect is pretty similar without zooming in, and it's happening on similar areas. It's weird. In the Resolve version, you can see it appear and disappear right here along the collar. So there it's appearing, and now it's disappearing, and now it's appearing again. Let's see if that same thing kind of happens in this one. It doesn't seem to. Okay, let's do this one real quick. See, it's much more subtle straight off the bat. And take that global diffusion down. And I'm going to amp up the local diffusion just to see. And I just think it's more accurate because it's happening where I would most expect it to happen, in the really high contrast areas, and it's not happening here where there's lower contrast. And that's even without getting into the source limiter, which is really going to fine tune how much contrast there has to be. Whereas the Resolve version had it all over this whole chandelier. I want to show you the difference between this bloom versus the one whatever it is we see in Resolve. And this works independently of the halation. So they can work in conjunction as kind of an overall look builder, of course, but these don't have anything to do with each other. Toggle that off and on. It's better. It's better, guys. All right, I don't want to get into the film grain too much, but it's very similar to what you get in Resolve, although it doesn't have all the parameters as far as presets are concerned. You just have size and amount. And it defaults to this film type negative, which is crazy. So you definitely want to change that over to positive, and you'll get a much more, or much less, I don't know, much less of that. The other cool thing about this one is you have a film resolution slider. I would say the film resolution slider would be over to the left, 8mm, something, right? And then middle, maybe 16mm, and then over to the right, 35mm. So that's kind of how I would think about this film resolution. And then you have also the ability to decide where the grain goes. The downside, aside from the price of Dehancer, is that it's much more computationally intensive. So it's once you have this enabled, especially the film grain, your computer will start to really struggle. The Resolve plugin is less intensive, I think. I think that the quality and the ease of use of the tools from Dehancer are better. I think that the result is more convincing, and I think that sometimes the Resolve built-in halation effect doesn't always look that great, and it's easy to make it look really bad. Whereas it's much harder to really mess up the halation in Dehancer. The Bloom is also, in my opinion, much better and actually resembles Bloom a lot more so than what's in DaVinci Resolve. And I'm not exactly sure if they're trying to make it an overall Bloom or if it's something that they're trying to relate more closely with halation in itself. But is it worth it? Because Dehancer is expensive. The full plugin is $400. It really just depends on your needs. Are you going to use it a whole lot, and are you getting paid? If you're going to use it a whole lot and if you're getting paid, then I think it's absolutely worth it. Just make that investment and hopefully you'll recoup that relatively quickly. If you're just a hobbyist or you're just kind of curious, don't worry about it. Just use what's available in Resolve, because I think you can get really convincing effects. And halation isn't something that you really want to like I don't know, blast out there because it is something that's really subtle. And I think it's also something that 99% of people who are just watching content don't even know. They don't even know what it is. They might see it, but it's not anything that they're going to be like, Halation. It's just part of the image. In that regard, I think you can get there with what's in Resolve. Hopefully that helps.